Major funding for these programs is provided by HSH Nordbank and First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Perfect Building Maintenance, Allied Partners, Greenberg Traurig LP, the Moynihan Group. Additional funding is provided by Antares Real Estate, Arbor Realty Trust, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Habitats, City Investment Fund, Cushman & Wakefield, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Fremont Investment and Loan, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, McSam Hotel Group, MUSS Development, LLC, Newmark Knight Frank, Palin Enterprises, Rosenthal & Rosenthal, Inc., Swig Equities, the Engel Berman Group, Titan Capital, the WITKOFF Group, YL Real Estate Developers, Extreme Contracting and Deconstruction.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller, host of the Stoller Report. People rent offices in New York City, but unfortunately for certain people, the office rents are becoming crazy. The prices are too high. Now, 6 years ago, after 9/11, you could have rented an office anywhere. But what's happened? What's happening to the market? The market's really hot. Today, I have 3 leading brokers who really have their hands on the pulse of the New York City office market. Glenn Markman, Executive Director at Cushman & Wakefield, David Falk, Executive Vice President and Principal at Newmark Knight Frank, and last but not least, John Membrino, Senior Managing Director at Studley. So what's going on, Glenn? I mean, you were on the show about 2 years ago. You know, rents weren't at this price. What happened? What changed the world?
You know, you really have the benefit of a lot of people who want to be in New York City. You know, you start with the leadership of New York from Mayor Bloomberg and Dan Doctoroff, and they've got a great team, and people want to be here. From January of 2007, New York's added about 14,000 jobs. From the beginning of 2004, we've added 89,000 jobs.
But you know, we said before, prior to the show, when the 3 of us were sitting, that you know, it's wonderful that we have jobs, but I gave you the example of that small accounting firm who could be on a building on 26th Street and they can afford paying a certain rent. Now that rent, and let's use it, if that tenant was paying $22 a foot on 26th Street and 8th Avenue, David, what the renewal would come up, what would the rent be?
Probably double that today, easy.
Fine.
And they would try to strip out the concessions to keep their rents low. So with that, it would still be probably mid-40s.
So it's $40. So here is that company, and you know, I'll ask John the same question. Here's that company who's really running at a, you know, they're a professional firm. This is not a hedge fund. You know, this is not where they're making money, Blackstone Country or Fortress or this and that. You know, they make a reasonable living, but if the partner has to pay $40 a square foot or $42 a square foot and they were paying $20, it's coming out of somewhere. Where do they go? What do they do?
Well, what they're going to have to do is hire the right broker who's creative and smart and look for some options that aren't necessarily easy to find or right under their nose. They're going to need to.
But where do they go? Do they you know, the 2 of you live up in Westchester. In 20 years, rents haven't increased in White Plains. They're $30 20
Correct.
years ago. They're still $20.
That's correct.
But you know, you take the train in. Not everybody wants to, these people who are on 26th Street aren't going to be able to get their employees to go up to White Plains. You know, it's the negative commute. So where does that small company, where does that nonprofit, you know, and you spoke before, the Jackie Robinson Foundation, where were they before?
So that was a tenant, it was a not-for-profit in Midtown, Side Street building. If they wanted to stay in Midtown, the rents were just going to be too much of a hit. So we went down, we looked all over the city, and there was a component of retail, so that was a little more complicated, but we ended up going to Hudson Square, where you're seeing a lot of people looking now, because large floor plates, renovated buildings, landlords with capital, and you can move in there and you could feel the neighborhood changing.
But this company said, hey, I don't have to be in Midtown. Even though I like to be in Midtown, I'll go to Hudson Square. You know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, nobody wanted to go to Lower Manhattan. We were saying before, look at what's happening in Lower Manhattan. These, not the Trade Center, not, you know, World Financial Center, because those are class buildings. I mean, these other buildings, what are they renting for, Glenn?
You know, you have your A buildings, World Financial Center, One Liberty Plaza, 7 World Trade Center, that are now in the $70+ a square foot range.
But if they were
building.
but if they were in Midtown, if they were 280 Park Avenue, if they were 1251 Avenue of the Americas, they wouldn't be at $80. They'd be at $125.
Correct. So you're
so what I'm saying is, you know, Lower Manhattan was the low-cost alternative. You know, you were able to go to 40 Broad. I mean, Wall Street today, there's no more Wall Street. I mean, there's Wall Street, but it's no longer office. With the exception of maybe 3 buildings, it's all residential. You know, 99 John is residential. Everything's residential. I mean, so where do tenants go?
Well, I mean, to answer your question, the net is if the trend, the current trend continues, some of them are going to have to leave the city, and some will have to find alternatives that are where they're making a lot of sacrifices and they're making a lot of compromises, and they're going to be in a fringe part of town.
Wait a second. I know he likes Brooklyn. I'm a Brooklyn-born guy. We like Brooklyn. You just said you rented somebody space in Brooklyn, right? What's wrong with Dumbo? What's wrong with downtown Brooklyn?
Well, that was very specific. That was a law firm who's downtown who spends a lot of time in the Brooklyn courts. So based on the discounted rent and the benefit of the REAP, it made sense for them to go to Dumbo. But that's very specific. That's
What about Long Island City, David?
Listen, this has been going on for years. As I said to you before, you know, everyone has talked about Long Island City as being the next potential. I just haven't found one instance where a tenant is going to pick up from Manhattan and risk recruiting and retention of employees.
You're saying that they don't want to go to Tishman Spire's 3 million square feet, potentially square feet in Queens?
Listen, that's not there yet. But I'll tell you, you go to Long Island City, and this is not a knock on it, but you could be in a building that you're an 8-block walk from the subway, you're walking past no retail. It's a concern. So, yeah, it's legitimate.
Right. I mean, for years, the only thing that I called the Jolly Green Giant, you know, the Citicorp building, that ugly green building, I mean, they had a captive audience. And it was even more captive because the people would never even leave. They take the train there,
right.
They go over there, they have the gym over there, they have other things. But, you know, there are others. What do you think of what's going to happen with Atlantic Yards? I mean, Ratner, on some of his properties in downtown Brooklyn, he wasn't able to rent it that easy originally.
I think, Glenn,
that's your area.
I think we're at the point now where projects like that, Atlantic Yards, Metro Tech, we're getting the next generation of tenants coming through those buildings. I mean, we're showing.
Who's moving there? Who wants to move to Atlantic Yards? I mean, Atlantic Yards is a far distance, you know.
You know, it's a far distance, but it sits right on the Long Island Railroad. You're going to have Frank Gehry projects all around you. You're going to have the arena. This is going to be no different than, say, 34th Street and 7th and 8th.
Come on. You know, look, come on. Herald Center, let's stop hyping that much, okay? I don't want to hear the appeal for Glenn Markman, 1-800 Atlantic
Brooklyn.
Yards, okay? You know, I think there's, you know, I don't think Atlantic Yards is the same thing. We were talking about your client, Chelsea Market area. I mean, that neighborhood today, what's happening? People want to be there.
It's
on
all
the Food
about,
Channel when they were probably
right.
paying next to nothing.
It's all about where there's a buzz in a neighborhood. That's really when people say to me, what about 28th and 9th Avenue or 37th and 8th? There isn't a buzz there yet, and maybe there will be. But Chelsea Market and 111 8th and Meatpacking, you go there, you feel it. There's an excitement. There's all these incredible companies that are growing, and they're young. And you have a young employee base. Rents there's no space. There's no space in the entire market, and when it comes available, there's competition because it's the buzz.
Okay, what about the Port Authority, which is this ugly building, okay? I mean, Sylvan Lawrence building, it occupies...
I mean, 111 8th.
111 8th Avenue, the old Port Authority building. I mean, what's rents going over there? I mean, it's a massive building.
Yeah, I have to ask, Paul, but I would say he's probably looking to ask in the 60s today. I mean, it's...
In the 60s.
Well, he has one tenant, Google, who is absorbing and taking as much space as they possibly can get in that building.
I mean,
So-
Yahoo is at 1065 Ave in the Americas. They don't love being over there, but that's where it is. Now, so what do you see happening? And it's a triple question. What do you see happening to the small company who really can't afford these outrageous rents? Where do they go? And how what are the alternatives for all of them?
I would say it is a hard question because it's not very clear, but I would say if I were working with one, we would look at subleases which are cheaper and there's less capital required, and downtown Manhattan. You could still find space in downtown Manhattan, which is in a John Street, a William Street, a Wall Street, good space, 24/7, security, cleaning, and it's an office building. It's not a converted loft, and you can rent space in the mid-30s per square foot.
What about the toy building? I mean, it was recently sold to L&L,
Right.
And I understand that they're thinking they're going to get $80 a foot. I mean, do you think this is 23rd Street? I know the NEWMARK principals have the Flatiron building, which is on master lease over there. But do you think people are going to pay $80 to be on 23rd Street and Fifth Avenue?
I don't think it's so much on the location. I just think it's that building has to prove itself to the market still. So
It's not going to be a toy building because the toy tenants can't afford that type of rent.
But office users want to know that there's a commitment from the landlord. They want to see it happening, and then he'll get some solid rents, but likely not to $80 a foot.
David, what do you think?
It's all about the size of the requirement, because it's not worth 80 for a 20,000 foot requirement. The people looking at that have been searching for big blocks of space. So do they go down to Wall Street? Do they go all the way west? Or do they pay a little more and be at a fantastic location? These are numbers. That area traditionally was a rental in the mid-20s. Then it went to 30s, and now it's mid-40s. Now today it's low 50s per square foot. That's a big jump. Low 50s to high 70s.
So let's go into that area, because I'm just trying to get an idea. If I was a company, somebody, Herald Square is very hot today. It's always been hot, but it's even hotter because it's Vornado country. You have Penn Station, you have the Port Authority nearby. Well, what are rents going over there in the Herald Square neighborhood?
Rents, believe it or not, are going for $60 and $70 a square foot in One Penn Plaza. These are.
But that's like an A- building, would you say?
In that submarket, it's an A.
It's an A building in that submarket. But I don't think in Jeffrey Files, 370 7th Avenue, he's getting that. I'd say he's getting $45 a foot. I'd say those buildings, which used to be the Furrier buildings, are probably getting $35 or $38 a foot.
Over at say 528th Avenue, a building that Jeff Gorell owns, they'll do a deal around $37, $38 a square foot for 40,000 square foot. That's
which I think
great
is
value.
Which is a good value.
Great value.
What about like in let's say between 26th Street and 32nd Street and Fifth Avenue, that neighborhood, because nobody at one time, I mean, I don't want to knock the Malkin property, but the Empire State Building, a lot of people don't like being in there.
Right.
Threat, it's a target and this and that. What about buildings in that neighborhood? What do you see as rents?
That's a funny submarket because you used to have the accessory business over there, and you had a lot of showrooms. It hasn't really been communicated where that area is going. The smaller floor plates, there's not large tenants there. I would say you're probably looking at a market there that's around $40 a foot. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think that when you're asking where do small law firms, the small accounting or nonprofits go, those are the type of buildings that you're going to have to search out and reposition those floors and those buildings.
Both John and David bring up interesting things. The buzz neighborhood, like Chelsea Market being a buzz, Dumbo for a specific type of tenant being the buzz. What about, there's been a lot of residential development on Greenwich Street. In that neighborhood, people like that neighborhood. The restaurants, and you have the not the Frank Gehry buildings. You have the Richard Meyer apartment houses over there. You had Morton Square. There is limited office space. Who's renting there, and what type of rents are there?
Well, you're really close to Hudson Square. The Hudson Square is just south of that. Hudson Square has floor plates of 50,000 square feet, so it's big tenants. Viacom just leased there.
Right, but I'm talking the smaller tenants. the smaller buildings, okay? The Hudson Square
There
is...
really aren't that many. I mean, I'm not
Those are the
sure.
old, a lot of those buildings are old
The old
manufacturing.
printers. They're the old printing
And
buildings.
those,
Right,
those
exactly.
tend to have at least 25 to 30,000
The
square
big,
feet.
Yeah.
So you're
There aren't a lot of small buildings in that neighborhood because they were large manufacturing and printing
those
buildings.
smaller buildings are more likely to be found on Broad Street and William Street and John and Lower Manhattan because your floor plates there are between 10, 15,000 square
right.
feet.
You know, we heard David's position on Long Island City. I haven't heard your position or John's position on Long Island City.
I have a theory. It's going to sound really elementary, but Manhattan's an island, and there's only so much of Manhattan. There are only so many developable sites. It takes 10 years to develop a site and build it. And New York is very different in that regard compared to other cities. You talk to folks in D.C. or Chicago, and they can't understand the way the rents spike. They don't get it. And in those cities, you can expand the city. You just got to push the city west. There's an island, and then there's rivers. And like David was saying, you get out to one of the boroughs in the river, it's a whole different world. It doesn't have the same infrastructure. It doesn't have the same people walking around. And that's reflected in rents.
But downtown Brooklyn is the third largest business district in the city and one of the largest business districts in the country. And they have approved about 4 million square feet of office space. And Blue Cross moved down there, Barclays Bank moved down there, other people have moved down there. Josh MUSS put some additions. I mean, do you see any of your tenants ever saying, I want to go to downtown Brooklyn?
Well, I'm a Knicks fan, so I'm not allowing any of my clients to go to the Nets.
Right.
I haven't had anyone even bring it up, but I think you're right. If the buildings are that impressive, it's going to make a statement.
I mean, I happen to be a Net fan. It takes some time to create the image. And, Brooklyn and Bruce, they started this thing 20 years ago. And it's now falling into place for them.
Okay.
The island is tightening here, and companies have to look over. But Long Island City, to get back to your question, they're a little bit behind where Brooklyn was. So when Bruce and I went walking around that area in 1985, 86, it's 21 years ago. So it's going to take some time till you get the retail on the street in Long Island City, and you get critical mass going. Brooklyn is a few years ahead in that.
What about the Bronx? I mean, it's the home of the Yankees,
Yankee fan.
Met Yankee, depends on which son I'm with on the day. But, it is the home of the Yankees, and Arcadia is redeveloping the former Sears Tower over there, mostly office. Then I think Simone has another job in the Bronx.
Right.
There are certain jobs in the Bronx. Who's moving to that? Who wants to move to that? Is it a Bronx-centric company, or is it somebody saying, could it be a nonprofit?
I mean, I see not-for-profit, or Westchester or Bronx-related organizations. I mean, I think Simone, he has a lot of medical that's moved in because they have very few Class A choices in that submarket.
And you got a large school, I believe. But there's a lot of city, state, federal, quasi-governmental agencies that are being priced out of Manhattan. That could be, that could be a great location for them.
Prior to the show, I was mentioning both of you live up in Westchester. You take the subway, you take the railroad. Related is putting up this building. Not Related. Vornado is putting up the building on 125th Street. It's going to be 550,000 square feet. Vornado doesn't. They're not risk takers. They must have a lot of ideas of potential tenants. Do you think any of your clients would move to 125th Street and Park Avenue? I mean, it's a very prime location. 1 stop on Metro North, 3 stops on the Lexington Avenue line.
I think you've got a solid landlord who's going to build a great building. And I think that
I'm not talking about the landlord. I'm really talking, you guys have a pulse on the tenants. You deal with landlords. You always deal with landlords, and you're also principals in certain aspects. My question is, who is going to be the tenant who wants to move there? Because what we discussed before, like Long Island City, who's moving there? Citibank had their situation. UN Federal Credit Union, they moved because they really needed it, so there was X number of square footage. MetLife moved to Long Island City. They decided to leave it because of this and that. Who's going to go to Harlem? Okay? I mean, most of the space, Bruce Ratner's building is all governmental. The Cogswell buildings are all governmental. the guy who originally was going to build this building, who was on my show, never to have again, he said he never wanted any governmental. You know, it's great having government. You know, companies in Washington D.C. love governmental. It's a good tenant.
I think, like David said, it's gonna come from either not-for-profits, educational, government. I think that's what it's going to be in Harlem. So,
you know, the two of you guys live in Westchester. I know you don't know what Westchester is. It's over. You have to go up the road. Okay?
It's north.
North.
Thanks.
Okay. White Plains in Westchester, 30 years. Nobody. The rents have not gone up.
it's funny you said that because I was telling somebody the same thing. I said, I've been in the business 21 years, and for 21 years, the rent's been the same.
But
You don't need to follow the market. They just ask you, and it's always the same.
But you know, I've had
rents.
Westchester guys. I've had Westchester developers. I've had Rexon. I've had, you know, the guy who owns the Atria building. I had Robert Martin companies. I've had these guys, and they say they think there's going to be new buildings being built up there.
You know, it's interesting. Look at Greenwich. Greenwich is more expensive than Park Avenue in some cases. Why? Because obviously that's the fund managers live up there. They go to work in a Lacoste shirt and jeans. But why can't White Plains, with the money in Purchase and Harrison and, you know, in Chappaqua, Armonk, it doesn't make any sense to
But
me.
you know-
Why don't you see the effect of
But
that?
David, you know, it's interesting. I had Joe Beninati on my show, who owns the building, and he said if the building is right on the train line in Greenwich, you get $125 a foot. If it's a little further down, it's $60. It really depends on location in Greenwich, and I agree. Why haven't? I mean, they're beautiful locations in
You should
White
see
Plains.
you should see a $10 increase just based on the fact that, you know what, these are beautiful buildings. I don't have to go into Manhattan. I could do my work out of here.
Park Avenue,
It's $99 a square foot average rent today.
$99. 57th Street. Solo buildings. Well, I mean, who's moving in? Who are the tenancies? What do we see?
These are private equity companies, hedge funds that want the best of the best. They want to be able to recruit talent. They want to be able to, you know, retain people, and they want to be able to see forever. They want to be able to be at the top of a building and not have anything block their view. They want to be able to.
You know, what about threats? You know, we've been fortunate. Couple of good years, you know, certain people didn't want to go to the top of, you know, Silverstein's building or in these high buildings. Empire State Building has always had that problem. I agree, but things can change. Security, you know, fortunately our security and all this happens. What happens if the market really, you know, the T-bill rates have gone up? Guys have bought buildings over here and they hope to get financing. Now they're having problems. RFR is having this problem in Stanford over here. You know, there's refinancing. Some of these landlords might have to take back space. They may have to take, you know, the landlords won't be able to rent it at the numbers they want.
Are you saying what can derail this? Is that
Yeah,
what
what
you're-
can derail it?
Well, an unforeseen event can derail it.
But
The
it's
stock
not
market
only-
dropping 2,000 points could derail it. I mean, we're heavily based here in New York City on the financial sector and financial services companies. So if that slows down, but you know, there's no sign that that's happening. In fact, what we see right now is another tipping point. Once the vacancy factor goes to 5% or below, we could be looking at rental rate increases of about 25%.
You know, and just to add to that, because we just did an analysis, and like Cushman, we look at employment. So between 07 and 09, you could be adding 12 million square feet of need based on jobs. There's only 8.5 to 10.5 million square feet of space coming on the market, which is going to bring the vacancy down from 5.5 to potentially 4.5 all of a sudden.
Okay, so David, you bring up something. So, and people want to be on this island, and there's X amount of square footage or space on this island. You know, very few people, including myself, really thought that the Times building would do that well on 41st Street. You know, you have space. You know, Africa Israel just bought the Old Times building. Right. That space over here. You have space on 48th Street, you know, the Worldwide Tower building that you can have space. Do you see the builders, you know, then you have Boston Properties, who's building on 47th Street and 8th Avenue. Boston Properties is building on 55th. Those are other buildings over there. So we have, and those are all specs. They were all spec buildings. So, you know, we're talking about X amount of square footage. Do we see Hudson Square, do we see the yards being built right now? What's your thought?
Well, I think the yards is 2012 and beyond for commercial space because they need to get the subway done.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, when I mentioned before, since 2004, we had all those jobs added, you know, and you take an average 200 to 240 square feet per person, it's about 18 million square feet of space that got absorbed by these new jobs. How many years do you think it's taken to create 18 million square feet in New York City? You can probably go back 15 years and you won't have 18 million square feet come online.
You know, all of you are in your 40s. You all went into the business in the mid-'80s. Do you remember in the mid-'80s Times Square when buildings were being taken back because they'd be being built as speculative? Okay, you remember the Bertelsmann building, you remember 1515, the W.T. Grant building. All these things happened. You know, the market was great. Now, what happens over here? I mean, you know, you can have this other situation. I mean, what you just said is fine, but I'm also looking, you know, history. We're in the longest cycle that we've had. And all of you, even though you're in your 40s, still remember 1987, 1988, right?
Absolutely.
When you were talking, Glenn, before about answering Michael's question about the market, you mentioned private equity. And I was thinking the same conversation happened in 2000 with .com.
Right.
What's driving the market? It was the new economy industry. And of course that vanished and it brought down so many parts of the city. Private equity hedge funds are responsible, basically, that one industry for bringing rents up because everyone followed. The B buildings wanted to be higher rents.
But David, I think you really make a great point with the .coms. I remember in 2000, I was doing some consulting for Deloitte & Touche, and I was downtown. I mean, no one knew what a tie was. You know, all of it was .com. I would have to tell them where to go for a suit. And one day, I still remember, we laid off 120 of these .com boys. 120. We didn't need all the space that we had. And that was the start of the end. And that wasn't a natural disaster. Well, you know, certain things happen. I'm not saying hedge funds, but if today's newspaper says, you know, Blackstone wants to go public and then they're going to be taxed it this way, you're going to see some of these hedge funds change certain things. If they have certain hedge fund regulations and the market has this 2,000-point cut that you said, the world can change.
I mean, the negative impact was the .com's crash, but it really was the NASDAQ going and coming down and the Dow. You know, these guys that are starting these sorry.
I got it from my producer. We are finished with time. Otherwise, I would continue. I think that for my final show of the season, I've got some really good perspectives on where the office market is. I'd like to thank Glenn Markman, Executive Director at Cushman & Wakefield, David Falk, Executive Vice President and Principal at Newmark Knight Frank, and John Membrino, Senior Managing Director of Studley, for being here. We'll have a couple of weeks of reruns and then come back September 18th when we talk about Lower Manhattan. See you next season.
Major funding for these programs is provided by HSH Nordbank and First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Perfect Building Maintenance, Allied Partners, Greenberg Traurig LP, the Moynihan Group. Additional funding is provided by Antares Real Estate, Arbor Realty Trust, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Habitats, City Investment Fund, Cushman & Wakefield, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Fremont Investment and Loan, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, McSam Hotel Group, MUSS Development, LLC, Newmark Knight Frank, Palin Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Inc., Swig Equities, the Engel Berman Group, Titan Capital, the WITKOFF Group, YL Real Estate Developers, Extreme Contracting and Deconstruction.